Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
With October on the horizon, well, it's Halloween season. We see everyday people getting in touch with their dark side. Well, some people do it all year round. But there is a genuine dark side to the human condition. You know, this place that speaks to terms like goods and evil. The Great Courses Plus has Dr. Daniel Breyer's lecture series called Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature. And this explores the often taboo discussions about the monsters within us, you know, the rationalizations of humans throughout history to carry out the worst of deeds, understanding our dark sides, how we repress them under civilized society. Perhaps most importantly, how to find peace and contentment in this crazy world. Understanding the dark side of human nature is one of thousands of lectures available at the Great Courses Plus, streaming into your life on your schedule wherever you happen to be on your computer via the Great Courses app. It's not just information, it's good information, the right answers taught by the world's greatest professors. So start learning today with the Great Courses Plus. They are offering my listeners a fantastic offer, an all-access trial for free. To get this great offer, sign up today with my exclusive URL. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. Don't wait. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. My guest on the broadcast today, Phil Zuckerman. He is a professor of sociology and secular studies in Claremont, California. He speaks and writes constantly on the subjects of secularity, atheism, apostasy, morality. He's written 6 books, including Society Without God, Invitation to the Sociology of Religion, Strife in the Sanctuary, Faith No More, and his latest book called What It Means to Be Moral, Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life. And morality is what I want to talk to Phil about today. Phil Zuckerman, thanks for being on the show. It's great to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for writing the book. I'm just sick and tired of answering the question, or actually answering the claim. It's not even a question. It's a declaration. You know, you can't have morals without God. Or the question version is how can you be moral without God? Give me the short version of what the book is and what it represents, and we'll go deeper in just a second.
I appreciate that. I do find, with that question, there's kind of 2 versions. There's the genuine, honest version. People genuinely ask, well, how can you be moral if there's no God or if you don't believe in God? And it's a real earnest question. And then you've got, I think, the more bad faith version, which is like their last trump card. I mean, it's like this is what they've got. They know that science has the upper hand, but if they can just pull out that morality card, then they've got it. So basically, I try to address both, and I try to do it in 2 main ways. First half of the book is actually deconstructing and critiquing any moral system that requires the existence of a supernatural invisible deity and faith in that deity. And I show that actually belief in God is extremely problematic, if not downright detrimental to a healthy moral and ethical experience or worldview. So the first half of the book is sort of attacking and critiquing and debunking any morality based on theism. And then the second half of the book is basically saying, okay, well, without a God, where does morality come from? What are its sources? How does it work? How does secular morality emerge? How does secular morality function? And what are the main virtues and precepts and promises of secular morality? Which I kind of conclude by saying we need the latter if we're going to solve the world's problems, so the former ain't going to help us at all.
We talk a lot about how atheism doesn't require really anything other than the absence of a belief in God. Atheists are this is kind of a, it's a problematic statement. That's why we always sort of segue to humanism. And you talk a lot about secular values. What do you mean when you say secular values?
What I find, I'm a social scientist by training. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a sociologist. I'm a qualitative sociologist primarily. So I do a lot of in-depth interviews. I do a lot of hanging out with people and taking field notes, a little bit like an anthropologist. And what I find is that when you actually talk to secular people and when you actually hang out with secular people, either in groups or informally, you very clearly can see and observe that there are certain key core values that secular people live their lives by. For example, the basic understanding that this is the only time we have. That is a frame of orientation that, this is all there is. There's nothing, there is no afterlife. And that's going to affect how we live our lives and decisions we make. You'll find that when people are thinking about how to treat others, there's a kind of empathy that kicks in, a sympathy, a compassion. How would I like it if that were to be done to me? I don't want to cause suffering. And so there's a kind of golden rule operative at play that affects our moral lives. There are, I think I talk about 7 secular virtues. In other words, there are key aspects of how we look at the world, how we understand our place in the world, our sort of existential philosophy, if you will, that contains a moral core that is quite conducive towards ethical living. And so I just kind of want to name them and call them out because we don't do that so much in secular culture. The religious person can say, well, I've got the 10 Commandments, or, I've got these Beatitudes from Jesus. They can kind of cite, well, I believe, this is what it means to be moral. You do this, you don't do that, do's and don'ts. And secular people don't have this kind of clear document or scripture. We're just living our lives. And yet I'm trying to hold up a flashlight or a mirror and say, we actually do live our lives by certain core values, and this is how I see them operating. And I bring a lot of social science in there, a lot of social psychology to show that this isn't just anecdotal. We actually have experiments that show, or attitudinal surveys with control groups that show that actually secular people are more moral on certain worldview orientations than theists.
It's interesting. You mentioned the 10 Commandments. I always hear the 10 Commandments invoked. And then what's that statistic that says that more than half of Americans can't name even 5 of the 10?
Oh,
if
yeah.
you're asked, so you're like, well, what's the most important commandments ever given to humankind by God? And of course, they say the 10 Commandments, and you're like, what are they?
Exactly.
They sort of grope and scramble for, usually they get adultery and lying and,
What's even weirder is, yeah, I totally agree with you. And I've even seen that on TV. There have been live politicians who say, we got to have the 10 Commandments, in every classroom. And I think it was like Stephen Colbert who once said, well, can you name those 10 Commandments? But what's even weirder is, think of that word, commandments. I mean, no one in everyday life would consider a commandment moral or ethical, right? I command you to do this. Well, the only response to a commandment is out of fear or out of docile obedience. I mean, we should do things because they are right and correct, and they're right and correct if they alleviate suffering, produce well-being, increase justice and fairness, whatever it is, something at work, politically, in your daily life. You don't do things because you're commanded to. That's a very subservient orientation. And, children have to obey commands, dogs and animals have to obey commands. But the only reason another person would obey a command is if they can't freely choose to do so. So even just the whole notion that we're walking around saying 10 Commandments bespeaks of how infantilizing religious morality can be.
You mentioned that in the book, what it means to be moral, why religion is not necessary for living an ethical life. And I appreciate that when you're talking about, we're often told that subjugation to authority is part of a moral framework. And we see it especially when it comes to our president, President Trump. I've got some MAGA hat wearing associates who insist that really the moral thing to do, the patriotic thing to do, the right thing to do is to stand behind the leadership. And it's about standing behind the authoritarian model, not an honest assessment of, hey, is this right? Is it just? Is it rooted in my value system? And so it's interesting that there seems to be a section of people who see obedience as just a de facto moral position, right?
You're characterizing it absolutely correct. And in fact, it's an abdication of moral work. It is moral outsourcing par excellence. It is basically saying, I am taking the existential freedom that is the reality of my life, which is meaning that like I really ultimately can choose how I want to be. That's Jean-Paul Sartre's whole shtick. And I'm giving that up. And I'm just choosing to obey. And when you do that, you are no longer doing the heavy lifting of ethical deliberation. You are simply signing off. In fact, it's amoral. It's sort of saying, to follow the dear leader. Again, children and animals, that's one thing. But once we're adults and we can reflect and we can ponder and we can feel and we can think, these are the things that need to guide our moral choices. And it's not easy. It's hard. Any living adult has at some point faced a moral dilemma. They're unavoidable. Someone tells you something. They ask you to keep it a secret, but you worry they may be in trouble. Do you say something? Do you not? A friend confides in you about something, but, do you tell? Things at work. We see things all the time. And if all we're going to do is obey somebody, a boss, a parent, a military commander, a priest, an invisible deity, we are abdicating our moral responsibility. And that's in fact one of my main critiques of God-based morality, because it's basically saying, silence your conscience, shut off your inner voice of, am I causing pain or not? Am I helping or not? And just do as you're told. And that's the worst approach to morality possible. And I think that authoritarian personality is what leads to the destruction we see when dictators take over and whatnot.
In my activism, I've often referred to the World Peace Index that refers to crime and violence, the economy of various nations, child welfare, political repression or the lack of it, the general happiness of the population. And time and again, it seems it is not the most religious, but the least religious who seem to be at the top, or the most peaceful of nations. And you referenced this, right? The societies with the lowest rate of God belief really do seem to be much happier, correct?
Oh, not just much happier. Yeah, as you said, much safer, more egalitarian, the best functioning courts, the best functioning educational systems, the best functioning elder care, child care. There's no question that on any indicator of societal well-being, just about, there's one, a couple here and there, but on almost any measure of societal health and well-being, whether it's violent crime rates, murder rates, environmental degradation, job security, peacefulness, well-being, happiness, so subjective, objective, whatever it is, you can look at any national rankings and you can correlate it by, how, weekly church attendance, strength of belief in God, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you have to control for whether it's a democracy or not. That's obviously a big factor. You can't compare dictatorships with democracies. But when you look at democracies around the world where people have a say in how their life is carried out and they elect their own representatives to govern them, the secular nations far and away do much better on just about every indicator of societal health and well-being. Now, that's not necessarily because religion is weak. I'm not making that claim. One could make that claim. I'm simply saying clearly that faith in God and religious worship do not produce the outcomes their adherents say they do, right? And it's just by way of analogy, like let's say somebody just says hey, carrots, if you eat carrots, you'll have no heart disease, but if you don't eat carrots, you're going to get heart disease. Okay, fine, let's check it out. And then you see all these countries, that eat tons of carrots, but they have high heart rates of heart disease. And then here's all these countries that don't eat carrots and they have no heart disease. We can throw that out as a causal factor. The same thing's going on with all these people who insist that you have to believe in God or society will fall apart and become immoral. Well, let's look and see. And what we're seeing is that those societies that aren't strongly believing in God, that have the lowest rates of church attendance, the lowest rates of belief in Jesus and the Bible and God, they're doing really well. And those countries that have the strongest belief in God and the greatest religious observances, they're on average doing really poorly. So clearly something else is going on here. It could be economic, it could be political, it could be cultural, it could be historical, but that's the point. It's something secular. It's something in this world that accounts for these disparities, and faith in God doesn't help at all, and losing that faith in God doesn't lead to moral chaos, as people have been saying for thousands of years.
Now, you've mentioned, though, an exception or two. Are we talking about the charity question? Are religious people more charitable than the non-religious?
Yes and no. So it depends if you want to look at that internationally, not necessarily. In fact, the Scandinavian nations tend to, individuals there tend to donate more than elsewhere, and those are highly secularized societies. Within the United States, yes, there's a huge body of literature showing that religious people give more time and money to charitable causes than secular people. But what we know is that that's not a result of faith in God. It's the result of being engaged in a community that bolsters and supports and encourages such charitable giving. And we know this from the work of Robert Putnam and David Campbell in their book American Grace, where they actually found, they've tried to understand this, why religious people are more charitable. And what they found is faith in God wasn't the answer. It was just belonging to a religious community. And how do they know this? Well, they were able to see that people who belonged to religious communities but were not believers in God, so they were there because of a spouse or because of being part of the choir or whatever, they gave as much in charitable time and money as believers involved in religious communities. And conversely, believers in God who were not involved in a religious congregation, so the kind of loners that they might believe in God but they're not joiners, they don't give as much as those who belong. So when you parse out faith in God and community belonging, you see it's the community belonging. And this is the case as well for seculars who are involved in secular humanist community. They also donate more time and money. So there is definitely something about being part of a religious community that is conducive towards increased charitable giving. But believing God is not the ingredient. It's the being part of the community that seems to be the factor.
Talking here with Phil Zuckerman, author of the new book, What It Means to Be Moral, Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life. I've noticed as an activist from my particular vantage, the difficulty that some seculars have doing community. I mean, we crave it, right? Where the human condition wants community. But it's also the herding cats thing, very strong egos, independent thinkers, people who pride themselves on being skeptics and whatnot. And it seems quite often we get groups together, and just like in the church, maybe even more so, there seems to be politics and splintering and egos clashing. And we struggle as a secular community with secular community. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of, we got more and more data on this from psychologists, for example, who profile the psychologies of people. And what they find is that the more religious are more group-oriented, like being part of a group of like-minded individuals, even have more friends. They're more social, they're more group focused, whereas the more secular individuals are more individualistic, say that being part of a group of like-minded individuals is not important to them, tend to have smaller social networks and social circles. There really is a strong correlation between individualism and secularity and communitarianism or communalism and religiosity. And then we also just have all the data of what you're saying is exactly correct. Most secular people are really not at all interested in joining a group based around their secularity. They might join a soccer league, they might join a theater company, they might, get involved in a political group, but the idea that they would join a group based solely on being non-religious, being an atheist, being an agnostic, being humanist, is really unappealing. And in fact, one anthropologist, Frank Pasquale, has estimated that fewer than 2% of secular people are interested or involved in joining secular community. And we're seeing the results of that now. There was a big explosion a few years ago of these godless churches, particularly Sunday Assembly, the idea that let's create community, and they're floundering. They're not doing well. And it shouldn't be a surprise. I remember Barry Cosman, who founded the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. Right away he said, they won't take. And I said, Barry, don't be such a pessimist. But the truth is, we are not you're absolutely right. There is something about being secular that we're skeptical of the pronouncements of others. We don't like to be told what to do or think. We don't like to be herded, and that's a good thing. It's a virtue in many instances. It's great for a healthy democracy, right? People that are not susceptible to groupthink or being part of a docile herd. Not that the herd has to be docile, but it does hurt us in terms of organizing. It hurts us in terms of community collective kind of heritage, if you will. We don't have that kind of. I'll just give you one crystal clear example. A good friend of my wife's brother recently passed away unexpectedly in his 50s. They don't know. He was found in his bed. Maybe it was a heart attack, an brain aneurysm. They don't know yet. But he just up and died. Well, what my wife's friend, because she's involved in Jewish community, experienced was that immediately there were a lot of people who sort of went into action to comfort her and care for her and cook for her, right? Like, she's dealing with, now she's going to deal with her dead brother's apartment and things and paperwork, and she's grieving tremendously because she was very close with this brother. And there are other people there who are helping her. They're watering her plants. They're dealing with her pets, all these things. And it's a community that clicks in. And I've known highly secularized individuals who are not part of religious communities who do not get that. And when they experience a death in the family, or they're often quite alone and quite adrift, and there's just not that community that kind of kicks in. So I actually, even though I'm a secularist, I actually do see in an American context where where we don't have excellent health care and we don't have great social work and we don't have a real strong social network, a welfare network, that lack of community can really come to the fore when it's needed, right? Most of the time we're just working, playing sports, doing our hobbies. We don't think about it. But when those times in life occur, those illnesses, those deaths, those trying times, I think that lack of the community is a real hole in secular culture.
Well, do you also think that the community, we talked earlier that it may fuel acts of goodness, charity, participation in making the world a better place? We're more effective at it as a community than we might be as individuals. Would you agree with that?
I would, and that happens on many levels. For example, we know that advertising works, right? This is one of the reasons that every company has a huge advertising budget. So if you're regularly meeting up at a congregation, you're going to constantly hear about opportunities. They're going to be advertising opportunities. Hey, everybody, we're collecting money for hurricane relief. Hey, everybody, we're collecting money for the local food bank. Hey, everybody, we've partnered with, this group that tutors homeless kids. And so you're constantly being exposed and asked. That's number one. Number two, there's a kind of social affirmation. If you do it, you raise your hand, you donate the money. There's a kind of warm afterglow you get when you decide to volunteer or donate that is increased when you have others observing and doing it along with you. And I agree that we lack those opportunities as secular individuals that are cut off from that. And again, maybe it happens at work. Someone does a money drive for relief at work, and then you can chip in. Or maybe it happens in your sports league. Hey, we're going to do a Super Bowl pool, to raise money for this children's hospital or whatever. But I agree that it's a lot easier to get things done. I'll just say even politically, right? Look at how the Christian right? Evangelical conservative Christians are a minority in America. They're even a minority within Christianity. I think somewhere between around 25% of Americans are evangelical Christians. And that's even that's maybe even an overestimate. And yet, because they are so strongly cohesive as a group, they were able to get on school boards, they were able to create media empires, television and radio networks, and they were able to get lobbyists, and they have an oversized influence on our culture and our society politically because they are such a strong unit. And secularists, whose numbers are the same if not higher, right? We're somewhere between 20 to 30% of the population saying we have no religion, we're growing, and yet we're not this significant cohesive chunk that is, influencing the society in such a direct way. I think we're influencing it in an indirect way for sure, but we don't have that political muscle. Politicians just don't listen to us yet. That may change in the next 20 years, but right now they're always worried about the religious right, but they don't seem to think about the secular left, as it were.
I got to take a short break. When I come back, we got to talk about the influence of the religious right. We are seeing the consolidation of power during the era of Trumpistan. We're going to talk about that with Phil Zuckerman. Also, we're going to get into the quote-unquote good book. Oh, it's going to be amazing. Stand by. We'll get into it right after this. My patrons get this show commercial free. They get it 2 days early. Thank you so much for supporting me at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. Special guest today is Phil Zuckerman. Got a new book out called What It Means to Be Moral, Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life. What a refreshing message, because I live in Oklahoma, right? I'm in Jesustown, Oklahoma, and, there's hundreds of churches, and everywhere I go, when they discover I'm an atheist, one of the first questions is, well, where do your morals come from? And many of them are genuinely shocked and surprised and want to hear the answer, because a world with an atheist who might be moral and charitable and good and have purpose and all the things that religion says it owns, to them, it's like going to another planet. It's like learning a new language. They just can't fathom it. It's like I'm taking them through the baby steps of how evolved ethical systems might actually work. Do you get into how we have evolved our systems of morality as a human species?
You bet. So what I try to do is I try to go through various sources of our morality as human beings. And so what I argue is, first of all, we get our morality from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of having evolved as social primates. And we developed brains that allowed us to successfully adapt to our environment and to live and reproduce. And we could only do that in a group context. And we could only have a successful group context if we understood what each other were thinking and feeling, and we could understand each other's motivations and have a desire to help out and cooperate. And so we evolved that way, not consciously, but that's how we lived in small bands between 20, 30, up to 80 people for millions of years as earlier primates, and then 200, 300,000 years as we are today. And it was through that long stretch of living in small groups, trying to survive as best we could, that we developed a strong in-group cooperative tendency, the ability to understand and think and feel what our fellow human beings are thinking and feeling. So number one, we get our morality from our evolved social experience as primates, which gave us brains that have a capacity for empathy and compassion, and that's what you need in order to be moral. Number two, we know that we are unable to care for ourselves upon birth. In fact, if no one cares for us, we will die, and that's the state for at least the first 2.5 years of our lives. So that means someone had to actively care for us. That meant they had to feed us, wash us, nurture us, protect us. So that early experience, Nell Noddings talks about this, that early experience of being cared for imprints a dyadic relationship with other human beings, and we start to understand that there's a give and take and how we respond to each other and how we feel. So we develop the capacity to care because we've been cared for. Number three, we get our morals from the people that continue to raise us as we grow. Usually it's parents. It could be aunts, uncles, grandparents, neighbors, older siblings, teachers, coaches. These people hone and nurture and shape our morality. Number four, we get our morality from the surrounding society and culture within which we live. And next, we get our morality as we grow from our own ability to reflect upon experiences that we have. We know what it feels like to get punched in the nose. We know what it feels like to have someone lie to us. And so we're constantly fine-tuning our morality based on our own experiences. So all of these I break out and into great depth, like how these are the scaffoldings of human morality, right? Our evolutionary past, the kind of brains we have. I even get into some of the neurology there, the experience we have being cared for as babies, the experiences we have as we are raised by other human beings, the surrounding culture and society in which we live, and our own personal experiences and ability to reflect and think and consider. And this is where morality comes from for everybody. It's not just secular people. That is the story of human morality.
I'm interested in the human animal. I know you referenced Franz de Waal in the book and the work that he has done with animals, looking at cooperation, ethical behavior. And there's so many similarities in human behavior. It's bizarre.
Absolutely.
You see all of these scenarios that they set up and you're like, hey, wait a minute. I see reflections of that in the human condition. Do you get into altruistic behavior? I mean, that's one of the questions I have from religious people is, well, when it doesn't benefit you and you're simply an evolved primate, they operate as if it's social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, that kind of thing. Why in the world would you ever do anything charitable or moral to benefit another when it never comes back to you? I'm asking it in the way that the religious have asked me. How would you respond?
Well, the first thing I would say is that's a real projection. I would say, wow, you must be a really selfish person. You must have no altruistic tendencies at all if you even would wonder about that. Like, that's telling me more about your soul than mine. That would be the first move. Not that that would help. That would probably end the conversation. So this is what I would say. I would say several things. Because we evolved as pack animals, right? The rugged individualist 10,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 350,000 years ago didn't survive, right? It's just that's it. We could only get through, we could only maneuver the weather and finding food and fending off predators and competitors as a group. And that's how we evolved. And the selfish lout didn't last long and didn't reproduce his or her genetics and his or her DNA. So we tended to weed it out. There's still a range, right? So in any group, there's going to be some people that are highly altruistic and some people that are highly selfish. We're not all the same. In fact, diversity is part of the reason we have succeeded. So these orientations are a bell curve, right? To this day. First of all, let's look at our closest primate relatives, right? Bonobos, chimpanzees. Well, let's just look there. What do we see? Aha. Evidence for caring for each other, tending to those who are wounded, helping get food for those who can't get it for themselves, cooperation. It's there, right? We can also look at babies. Look at all the research being done in Yale and elsewhere on infants, right? We are seeing altruistic tendencies in babies before they are even verbal, right? The baby can watch a puppet show and they can see a helpful puppet and they can see a selfish puppet and they are drawn to the helpful puppet and don't like the selfish puppet. There are experiments where they will assist someone, a parent who can't reach their keys. I mean, so if you look at our own infants, clearly there's something hardwired there. I use that term gingerly as a sociologist, but clearly we are predisposed through our genetic inheritance to note when someone is suffering and want to alleviate that. And secondly, we can look at our closest primate relatives. Obviously, that's not going to help to the person that doesn't understand the scientific evidence for evolution, but there it is. And then the next thing I would say is, even through experience, we realize that if we're all just selfish, life is miserable, right? We learned that in kindergarten. If everybody just didn't stand in line and just grabbed the cookies, it was miserable. It was chaotic. So there is a kind of altruism that grows from our understanding of how we interact. Cafeterias function better when people get in line. The dental office works better when everybody's following the rules and signing in. Like, there's an understanding that if we're all just selfish, it's not going to end well. And that gets to the kind of like treating people the way you would want to be treated, which is sort of a bedrock of human morality. And you find articulations of that notion well before we get Jesus, long before we get Muhammad. I mean, you can see it in ancient Chinese philosophy. You can see it in ancient Egyptian writings. Treat people the way you want to be treated. It's a basic reciprocity that just makes moral sense. But at the end of the day, even if I were to concede to the Bible thumper that, man, yeah, you're right. How do you explain altruism and why aren't we all stingy? That's not evidence for God. That's just kind of describing the boat we're in. And if that's true, well, shit, we got to deal with it. In other words, you can't, that's putting the cart before the horse, right? It's sort of like saying, well, we're broke. Well, that must mean we're going to win the lottery. Well, what do you mean we're going to win the lottery? Well, we got to win the lottery because we're broke. What else are we going to do? It's like us being broke doesn't mean we're about to win the lottery. So if we are naturally selfish and we have no way to account for altruism, that doesn't prove there's a God. If anything, it just proves, man, I guess we're a pretty selfish species. And maybe we are. Look at the way we're destroying planet Earth. They may be right. It may be true that we're so selfish that we're just going to destroy the Amazon rainforest. We're going to use up all the resources. We're going to destroy every animal. We're going to arm ourselves and shoot everybody, and it's not going to end well. That may be possible.
You start the book talking politics, and, I'm going to get myself in trouble because I'm going to talk politics. We are seeing the sellout of the evangelical right. I mean, I think it's a kind of sellout, at least if they hold to the best verses of the Christian Bible, in the pursuit of and the maintaining of power during the Trump administration. We've got Dobson, we've got Jerry Falwell Jr., his father started the moral majority, talk about claiming an ownership on morality based in a specific religion. You've got the Paula Whites of the world, the Franklin Grahams, and these guys seem completely unconcerned about a Trump that stands in direct contrast with all the best teachings of Jesus. And at the same time, out of the other side of their mouth, the other side of the forked tongue is talking morality and talking about goodness. Can you speak to, and would you speak to, morality in regard to the Christian right here in the United States?
That would be one of the main prompts in getting me to write this book. I mean, I was just really shocked by what I was seeing, and I'll start with an anecdote, and I'll expand from there. I have two colleagues here where I work at the Claremont Colleges in California. They're both scientists. They're both chemists, and they work in our joint science program. One of them, I'll call him N, told me this story that another colleague of ours, T, so there's N and T, they're both chemists. One day, N was at the copy machine, and it came out that he was an atheist. And T, the other chemist, of course, was shocked. And T said, "What? You're an atheist?" And proceeded to berate N and said, "How can you be moral? If you live in a godless universe, there's no morality. There's nothing compelling you to be a good person." On and on and on. And New was taken back. He didn't have a ready set answer. In a sense, it's kind of like for him that I wrote this book. But here's the deal. T, let's start here. T is a Trump supporter and is not. T's the one claiming to be moral. He's the God believer, supports Trump. T denies the evidence of global warming. T hates the Black Lives Matter movement and just thinks it's bunk. T hates movements to safeguard women's reproductive rights. T does not want to provide health care to poor people. He thinks that if they're lazy, they're lazy. He loves guns, right? So let's look at this list, right? Loves Trump, loves semi-automatic weapons, doesn't want women to be able to control their own bodies. It hates movements that are fighting racism in our criminal justice system, is suspicious of providing health care to people who need it. And yet he's claiming to be moral. And here's N over here, who wants to save planet Earth from burning up, who wants to provide health care to poor people, who is really concerned about our children getting gunned down constantly by these semi-automatic weapons, who is concerned about racial injustice, and he's being called immoral, right? He's the immoral atheist. What I'm arguing is that if you look at the moral issues of today, and let's be clear, politics is morality, right? Our political decisions affect the lives of others. That makes them moral issues. On every issue, the strong Christian evangelicals are on the immoral side. They want more guns, which will produce more death. They want to fight against, they want to keep burning up our natural resources, and they want Earth to get hotter. That will produce more suffering. They don't want to provide health care to poor people. They like it that people 500,000 Americans go bankrupt just trying to pay their medical bills, 500,000 every year, right? You get cancer and now you got to go fund me. That's immoral, but they love it. They want to keep more children in cages at our borders who are simply fleeing poverty. I mean, on and on and on. They want to see more Palestinians getting their bones crushed under the boot of Israeli torturers, right? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And yet they claim to have the moral high ground. I don't want to say sick and tired, that's a cliche, but it is time for secular humanists to stand up and say, on the moral and political issues of the day, we stand on the side of ethics. We want to end human suffering. We want to produce greater good in society, greater levels of well-being, better health care, better elder care, no more school shootings. We want to have a green planet. And we're called immoral? Are you effing kidding me? And so that was, as you can tell, that was a large part of the electricity in my fingers as I wrote this book.
I mentioned the best verses of the Bible. You get into the worst verses, and there are a great many to choose from. We talk about the good book, the greatest book ever written, blah, 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 blah. And, of course, you go through, and it's almost an obligatory expose of the worst, the stuff that many Christians either don't know is in there or are unconcerned that is in there. You want to speak to that real fast?
Look, yeah, to me, the Bible is remarkable. It's an incredible compendium of human history, storytelling, strivings, poetry, self-reflection. It's incredible, right? Written thousands of years ago in the Middle East, when many people around the planet weren't writing things down, weren't developing these kinds of narratives in the written form. Obviously, they were in oral traditions. But I mean, the fact that some people in the Middle East, some ancient Jews, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago wrote these stories down, and many of them are very incredible stories. And my feeling is that the Bible contains what is in the human psyche, the best and the worst. It contains our better angels of our nature and the worst demons of our nature, which is there as well, right? And I can talk about that. The problem is when you see it as a book from a supernatural deity. Now we have a real problem. And I'll just give you some examples here. In the two that I think are really important for people to recognize is that there are many instances in the Bible where God commands genocide, right? And I bring that up because that's always the go-to. Like when religious people will be like, there is objective morality. And you'll say like, well, for example, there's like genocide just is wrong. We can all agree it is objectively wrong to commit genocide. And yet the very Bible that they are, hugging is full of pages of genocide where God either directly commands people to commit genocide or allows them to commit genocide by, stopping the sun so that the armies can continue the slaughter, or commits genocide himself, right? The Great Flood killed all these people. Now, the next one is the issue of slavery. Again, this just kills me. Like, the Bible's very clear that slavery is okay. The Old Testament is very clear that people can enslave others, own them as property, pass them on to their children. And the New Testament is just as accepting of slavery as the Old, right? It even says slaves obey your masters. There's passages in the Bible that talk about being obedient to the government, that God puts those in power. These are horrible, horrible anti-human rights orientations here, promoting and supporting genocide, promoting and supporting slavery, saying that God puts people in power to rule over us. These are recipes for human suffering writ large.
Would you define morality as reducing suffering? I mean, if I had to put it down to a byline, how would you define morality as a secular person? Yeah,
to me, morality is about decreasing unwanted suffering, increasing fairness and justice in society, treating people with empathy and compassion. If I had to, I have more, but that's what I would say. Yeah, like alleviating unwanted suffering, doing things to increase well-being and happiness, and doing things that make society more just and fair.
Here at the end of our conversation, just give me a slug for the book, man. I'm going to send everybody that direction. I'll put a link in the description box, but just kind of give us the reason to go dig deeper, okay?
First of all, if you've ever been asked, how can you be moral if you don't believe in God? I feel like this book is perfect. I tried to pack it with everything from psychology to evolutionary biology to philosophy, criminology, sociology. It's empirical. It's data-driven. I like to think it's highly readable. So that's number one. Number two, if you're pissed off by the theocracy, the emergent theocracy that is happening in this country with evangelicals dominating positions of power, and you want to speak moral truth to that power, I think this book will help out tremendously. And if nothing more, a great gift for your, Trump supporting uncle.
What it means to be moral, why religion is not necessary for living an ethical life. Phil Zuckerman, you're a good man. Thanks so much for spending some time with us here on the radio.
Thanks so much, Seth. My pleasure.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.